Welcome to Flashpoints. I'm Jeff Pegues, and I'm joined by CBS News senior national security analyst Juan Zarate. What is the latest on negotiations with Iran?
Well, what we see are signs and signals that the Iranians, at least, are growing more positive about a potential deal. Some hesitation from the American side, but a lot of anxiety around what that deal looks like. And so it appears that we're marching toward a potential deal that would have an element of the establishment of an Iranian nuclear capability, allowing that to persist with checks and balances and restrictions, some degree of lifting of sanctions, or at least commitment to that. And then the question of whether or not there's going to be a sunset provision, which has come much into the news, especially after Bibi Netanyahu's speech to Congress. But I don't think you're going to see an administration that wants to delay further and do what it's done in the past two rounds, which is to simply kick the can down the road. They're going to want to make a deal if they can, and all the tea leaves seem to suggest that we're moving toward a deal. The real question is going to be, is it a good deal, and how is it perceived in places like the Congress and in Israel?
Well, obviously, some members of Congress do not believe this is a good deal. You have the letter from the 47 senators last week. Did that derail the process at all? Obviously not, based on what you're saying.
I don't think it did, and in fact, you know, it may have thrown a bit of a wrench into the initial dialogue, but the negotiations have been underway for months, and there's been a momentum to them in some ways. I think the Iranians sense that the administration really wants a deal, needs a deal. I think the administration has invested so much time and effort in this, and you know, based on what other analysts are suggesting, and I think it's somewhat right, is that the administration in some ways is investing in the idea of Iran long-term serving as a stabilizing force in the region. You see them now fighting ISIS. You see them in other parts of the region. Now, that's a very contrary view to what the Republicans are thinking, certainly what Bibi Netanyahu thinks, and including our Sunni Arab allies like the Egyptians, Saudis, Emiratis, who see Iran as a real fundamental danger and see their influence growing in a very negative way, as opposed to being a stabilizing force. And so the way that that we see the contours of this deal and the way that it's read is going to be incredibly important, and will differ based on where people sit and how they view Iran.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say there are a lot of wheels in motion with this potential deal, and you talk about that letter, and one Senator, Republican, who didn't sign on to that letter was Bob Corker of Tennessee, who has expressed concerns about the UN role in all of this. And our State Department correspondent, Margaret Brennan, sat down with Secretary Kerry, who had this to say.
We are negotiating under the auspices, to some degree, of the United Nations. So just as Congress has to vote to lift sanctions, so Congress does have a vote, so does the United Nations have to lift some sanctions at some point in time.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting because it's clear that the administration is posturing around the idea of going to the UN with the deal. And the UN's important because there are a number of Security Council resolutions that have to be implicated and unwound if you're going to lift sanctions. And so Secretary Kerry's point is, look, there's a UN dimension to this in addition to an American congressional dimension. The problem, though, Jeff, and really the danger here, and I'm subscribed to this theory, is that if the administration is really trying to reshape the sanctions regime at the UN level first, they're really undermining the role of Congress, and they're also tying the hands of the United States in terms of what sanctions can be used later if the Iranians cheat, for example, or if we want to use sanctions for other reasons. They're supporting terrorism, they're doing other things. To unwind sanctions at this point is to mean you're never going to get the same sanctions in place, because the Chinese and the Russians are not going to agree to something, especially after a nuclear deal. And so the question is this the right strategy? Are we tying the hands of not just this president, but the next president in terms of dealing with Iran if we go to the UN first, as opposed to figuring out what we want to do with the sanctions here in Washington?
So we'll have to see where these negotiations go next. For Juan Zarate, I'm Jeff Pegues, and that is Flashpoints.